Throughout the process, I will be letting you know the techniques I used and additional commentary. I hope this helps you if you decided to ever recap your PS1 and install a mod chip on it. Enjoy. I first used no clean flux and my J-angled tip on the soldering iron, but notice the solder would not flow even after trying to add fresh solder. Just like you see here. I changed to rosin paste flux and tried adding fresh solder, but as much as I tried, it would not flow either. I may not have been using enough heat. I then thought it was best to just use the hot air rework station. As you can see, it worked like a charm. The settings for my hot air rework station were 30% airspeed and 380 Celsius. I did the same on this capacitor, applied rosin paste flux, grabbed onto it with my tweezers, and using a side-to-side motion, blew hot air for maybe 10 seconds until the capacitor easily lifted off the pads. I repeated the process of applying rosin paste flux and using the hot air until it came off. I used the desolder braid to start cleaning up these pads. As you can see, there is a lot of residue left over from the capacitors in this area of the board. The solder would not flow, and I applied a bit of no clean flux, and I was still having trouble picking it up. I tried adding in fresh solder, mixing it in with the old solder, but as you can see, that was a challenge. Coming in with the desoldering wick to remove as much as I could with my J-angled tip, then adding no clean flux and nothing. Added rosin paste flux and got a better flow, but it was still difficult. Then I touched up these test points while I was in the area. I kept trying to remove as much solder as I could. Added more rosin paste flux to these pads and was still faced with the fact that the solder would not flow easily. Until I managed to remove as much solder as possible. Once that was done, I wiped the whole area with a Q-tip drenched with 91% IPA. After that, I also used a clean toothbrush with more IPA to get an even cleaner surface. You will have to forgive me here in this part because I had already installed 2 of the 4 capacitors and realized later my microscope wasn't recording. Sorry about that. Anyway, the technique I used here to install C617 was, as you saw, applying paste flux to both pads, but only applying fresh solder to the negative pad where the negative lead attaches to. I flow the solder and slide the lead in. Once that is secured, I go to the other side of the capacitor, the positive side, apply solder to the pad, and gently press down on the capacitor until it was level on both sides. Then with my tweezers, I made sure it was fully secured down. For C605, I applied flux, cleaned up the pads, and applied solder to the negative pad. Sliding in the capacitor on the negative side, or lead. Then added solder to the positive side. Came back to the negative side and gently pushed the capacitor down. I did this repeatedly until it was fully secured down. So I know I already worked on that capacitor. It is a good idea to mark it. I used a Sharpie here, and that way I know that capacitor is new when I see it, and there will be no question. The capacitor kit that I got from console5.com has some notes on the polyethylene bag it came in, noting this capacitor is non-polar and it can be installed in either orientation. The top part of the capacitor lacks a black marking. I decided to install it as if it were polar and kept the base with the cutoff corners on the positive pad and the other side on the negative pad. Using the same technique so far, this time however, I pre-tinned the positive pad and slid the capacitor on this side, then added solder to the opposite end. Then touch each pad with the iron and pushing down until it was level on both sides. I want to address what happened here. When I approached the positive pad with my iron, I accidentally contacted this resistor, 220, and lifted one end from its place. One of the things I have learned by doing this work so far is to keep your cool and not freak out the moment something like this happens. This is a simple fix. It's easier, however, using the right tool. Here I used the hot air once again and directed the airflow to this resistor, and with the tweezers made sure it sat back in its place and moved the hot air away. Yet again, the same technique is used on this capacitor, pre-tinning the positive pad, sliding the positive lead of the capacitor into the flowed solder, then adding solder to the negative side. Once the pad is filled, I push down gently on both sides. Then mark the capacitor with a Sharpie, and lastly, tugging at it a little with the tweezers. For this one, I decided to use the hot air for a few seconds as I wasn't sure if the capacitor was fully flat against the pads. I want to point out that it's best to hold on to it down for a few seconds until the solder solidifies, and then I let go. I noticed this nearby resistor had excess solder. I tried to remove some of that with the desoldering braid, but as a result, I lifted it off its place, and watch what happens next. The tiny resistor flew off the braid and I lost it. What I decided to do, because I couldn't find it anywhere, was to bridge this connection using 28 American wire gauge enameled copper wire. I bent a piece to size, and to handle it, I left the long end and used that to set it down. Soldered it in place and cut the wire. Once that was completed, I proceeded to install this capacitor. This time, however, I decided to change my strategy. Trying to avoid another incident with a nearby component, I used the hot air rework station. I applied paste flux and pre-tinned both pads so they both solder simultaneously while applying hot air and gentle pressure to set the capacitor flat. First, I aimed the hot air at the pads to start flowing the solder. At first, I wasn't setting down the capacitor fast enough such that when I placed it down, the solder had solidified. I acted upon the next strategy, which was to set it down and apply hot air directly onto the pads while keeping the capacitor in place and pushing it down. I must mention that doing all this simultaneously might sound easy. It is definitely not, as I was making sure not to spend too much time aiming the hot air on the capacitor, as it can easily blow up. This has happened to me before. Now I applied IPA and scrubbed it down with the toothbrush, making sure it's secure with the tweezers and marking it with the Sharpie. Same technique applied here. One difference was that I pre-tinned both pads this time. I do want to note that this technique of soldering one lead at a time is a bit cumbersome. The reason being is that, at least in my case, I had to switch hands every single time, changing the iron from my right hand to my left hand and changing my tweezers from my left hand to my right hand 3 or 4 times. It might be a workspace constraint situation, but I just couldn't handle crossing my right hand over my left hand and trying to coordinate what I was seeing on the microscope to what I was doing physically. It was just too much to handle. Another similar installation, with the difference that I didn't need to switch hands to hold the soldering iron, and I was able to solder down both ends of the capacitor. Also, this capacitor is located near the edge of the board, so there is nothing nearby that gets in the way when approaching the soldering iron, which made this one particularly easy to install. Keeping consistency along the way, pushing down the capacitor gently on both sides until it is completely flat on the board. After it was set down, I wiped the area clean with a Q-tip. Same technique on this capacitor as we have used so far. The base of this capacitor was a tad larger, and it didn't allow me to get a good view of the negative pad when approaching it with the soldering iron, so I decided to use hot air instead. Pressing down on the capacitor until the solder flowed well and setting it down flush on the board. With the tweezers, I made sure it was secure and I marked it. For some reason this resistor was out of its place, so I put it back with hot air. The same technique is repeated on this capacitor. Now this part is where it gets interesting. Before I explain how I fixed it, let me talk about how I got here. I recapped this entire board once before this, and it did nothing for the issues I was having on the console. Those capacitors were hand selected from a capacitor box I purchased off Amazon, which includes a wide variety of capacitors. Since that did not work, I decided to get the kit from console5.com, which includes all the capacitors that are needed and are selected appropriately. When preparing for this new kit, I decided to remove all the capacitors I had just installed to make way for the new ones, and when I was lifting this capacitor in particular, the entire pad ripped off the surface and stuck to the solder. Not only that, it took part of the trace with it. Yet again, I did not panic and thought, well, there must be a way to fix this. What I decided to do was to look at the printed wiring board I found online and see what the trace contacts from the positive lead of the capacitor. I will show a picture of it here. I found that this pad connects to R542, a 10K ohm chip resistor, and goes straight into FB501, a bead ferrite chip. My thought process was if I could sandwich a short length of copper wire in between the lifted pad that I was able to recoup and pass it underneath the resistor and connect straight into the ferrite chip, that should make up for the trace that I accidentally lifted. As you can see here, it was not easy, very nerve-wracking, but I kept my concentration and determination to make it work. I was able to place the copper wire connecting all these 3 points I mentioned, and now what was left to accomplish was first to solder the positive lead of the capacitor onto the solder holding the wire and the pad underneath. Very carefully and with patience, I managed to do so. Then I added solder to the negative pad and lead and ensure that the capacitor was fully soldered here. Making sure I pushed down gently as I didn't want to ruin the work I had already done on the opposite end. I needed to use the desoldering braid here to absorb excess solder from this joint because it was way too much. Then last, I replaced the chip resistor in the correct orientation and placed it at an angle on top of the copper wire and solder. Then I added solder to the other side of the resistor to secure it down. I removed the excess copper wire, and after that I cleaned up the area with the Q-tip and the toothbrush with IPA. After that, I tugged on it very gently with my tweezers to feel if the capacitor was secured in its place, and it was. This was a very challenging fix on the spot, but my recommendation is to, once again, keep your cool, think about potential solutions instead of giving up. I'm pleased to say this repair was successful. To install C407 without running into too much trouble, I had to ensure I had enough space to move my soldering iron around. To do this, I made sure the nearby capacitors were out of the way. So I removed C550, C551, and C508. Then I proceeded to clean that area with Q-tips and IPA. Now that I had a more open area to work in, I proceeded to install C407 with the same technique using the soldering iron, as I have stated many times at this point in this video. While I was working in this area, the positive lead of C519 kept catching my attention, and I thought I better go back and make sure it is fully secure, as I do not plan to come back to this capacitor soon if I don't need to. I want to set it and forget it, so to speak. I added more solder and pushed down on the capacitor to get a good feel of it sitting as close as possible to the copper wire underneath it. Then I slid the solder underneath the negative lead to ensure there was enough solder there, as earlier I was only concerned about the outer side of the capacitor. These three capacitors are big in size, and the technique using the soldering iron worked well, so installing them here was the easiest in comparison to the rest of the capacitors on the board so far. I didn't have to resort to using the hot air station to install these, as you have seen me do for previous capacitors. With C407, I stumbled across a small problem. I bumped resistor label 332, and when trying to get it back into place, I also bumped this ceramic capacitor, but both were easy to put back in their respective place. The very last capacitor I installed was C409. I used the tweezers to make sure all of these capacitors were secured down, and they were. Once they were all done, I marked them and ensured they were sitting flush against the board. And now we are officially done recapping this PlayStation 1. All 16 capacitors. Now let's move on to installing the MM3 mod chip. For the mod chip, we will start by pre-tinning all the connection points and soldering a wire to each point. I am using a 30 American wire gauge single core tin plated copper wire here. Then I'm preparing points 7 and 2, which after looking into it a bit deeper, it appears I didn't need to connect the second pin of the MM3 mod chip. But I guess it's too late now for that, so I will keep it on. This isn't detrimental to the performance of the chip. I have already tested it and it works just fine. After going through all the work and replacing all the capacitors, soldering wires really didn't feel as challenging. And guess what we have here? Remember that chip that I lost earlier in the video? I found it by pure coincidence. This made me very happy. So let me show you how I put it back in its original place. I simply wiped the copper wire piece away with the tip of the soldering iron and replaced the resistor. To resolder it back into place, the easiest method to use was the hot air. As soon as I pointed the hot air in its direction, the solder reflowed easily, and with the help of the tweezers, all I did was set it back in its place, and that was all. We continued to point 3. Here you must touch the resistor very gently. It made it particularly difficult as the resistor I needed to solder to was the middle one. And with a minimal touch you can accidentally join them together like I did right here. But it was easy to undo the mistake. Once that was fixed, as you can see, I added solder to the tip of the iron and lightly touched the resistor until it had enough solder for the wire to latch onto. I soldered the wire and moved on to the next one. Point 6 solders to this ceramic capacitor. Similar strategy used here. Lightly touch it with solder on the tip of the iron to have the wire latch onto that. I will point out that I placed the wire on the side where the fresh solder was to create a good joint. Now we go for point 5. This one was simple and straightforward, as you can see here. For point 8, I added solder to this ground plane and soldered the wire here. Now that all the wires are soldered to the board, I did a bit of wire management. I took each one and found a route to conceal it using the surrounding IC chips. This was achieved by threading the wires 2, 3, and 7 through the legs of the chip IC732 and 1 and 4, surprisingly underneath the chip labeled IC310. I drew a very simplistic picture of how I routed each wire here for you to see. Please excuse the crooked lines, this is for you to get the idea how I did it. I honestly didn't know there was a chip that was raised enough to have clearance underneath it, so I fed a few wires through here, which like I mentioned was 1 and 4. This was a neat way to conceal a lot of wires for this mod chip, which otherwise would be flying all over the board, making it look unpleasant and, let's face it, unprofessional. When that was completed, I threaded each wire through its corresponding hole of the mod chip from underneath. The idea here was to shorten the length of each wire by pulling it taut and bending it slightly so that the mod chip sat as close as possible to the board. Once I was ready, I cut each wire with my flush cutters, but I left enough wire length available just in case. Then with the heat of the soldering iron, I removed the silicone wrapping on each end to reveal the tinned copper wire. I added paste flux and proceeded to add solder to the ends of each wire and create a good joint to the through hole, as you can see here. I repeated the same process until I added solder to all 8 points on the mod chip. When I finished soldering all points, I cleaned up the mod chip by melting the remaining flux and absorbing it with a Q-tip. Then I applied some IPA on the toothbrush and wiped the mod chip clean. And here I'm showing you quickly the finished work. Lastly, I applied a piece of capped-on tape to the top of the mod chip to protect it from shorting with the top shield of the console once I get it reassembled. And finally, the installation has concluded. So at this point, we have our console fully recapped and with a mod chip. And that's all. All right, now that we've got everything set up, let's try a game. This is Parasite Eve on a verbatim CDR. As you can see, it went immediately to the PlayStation logo, which was always a good sign. And there it is. It's going to load up the intro sequence. Let's check it out. Audio is great. Video is great. Pretty awesome. No skips, not skipping at all. There you have it. Reads the disc perfectly, no skips, no nothing. Let's try Suikoden 2. This I recorded at 10 times speed. And I'm choosing this one because it's a game that has a very good intro sequence. That way we can put to the test this repair. Now you see sometimes this happens, but that's okay. All you need to do is turn it back on again and it'll recognize the disc. I know it's not perfect, but it reads it. Just like this. There it is. Incredible audio. Sounds fantastic. No cut, no skips. Perfect. The intro to this game is so epic. Nice. Alright guys, so if you made it all the way to the end, I salute you. I salute you and appreciate you. Thank you so much for checking out this video. This was a successful repair, a successful recap of the entire console, and it was a lot of fun. It was great to do, and yeah. Again, thank you so much for watching. Leave a like, comment, subscribe. Check me out on Twitch. I am also streaming there more frequently, so I'll catch you guys there. See you guys next time.